my understanding of what racism is, and not to become too deconstructionalist on this entire conversation, but we kind of have to, when people use that term, you're being racist or racism, I have always interpreted that as it's not okay that you have a preference of your race, their culture, their social habits, whatever, over somebody else's. That's racist. To say that you prefer your own culture, you like the way white people look, you like the way they run things, that is the definition of racism. And so I could not reconcile how I'm sitting here listening to a pastor tell 1,000 white people on one Sunday morning, you know, he's probably done this before, that all 1,000 of you are committing an egregious sin. It's a separation from God. Every time you believe that I would really prefer my neighborhood to be majority white. I'd like to live amongst mostly white people. I want to marry a white woman. I want to have white kids. I want my kids to go to white schools. Well, I promise you, if you say all of those things, they'll interpret that as racism, right? So how do you fix this? I mean, how can you fix, even in the most religious parts of America, the message from our very influential pastors being broadcast to thousands of people at a time, that if you even think that you as a white person would prefer for things to stay mostly white, well, you got to stop there because you're sinning.
I would say that the issue becomes a conflation of ideas, inflation between racial preference and the actual sin of, I don't really want to call it racism, I'd say prejudice, is somehow mishmash together. But if we look even in, say, the 1920s, the 1930s, 40s, 50s, even leading up, I would say, to even like the 80s, it was not uncommon for people to express this preference while at the same time rightfully condemning prejudice towards other races, because the two are not intertwined in any way. It's a false dichotomy to say you either have to be completely colorblind, which oftentimes seems to only be applied to white people and not any other race of people, or you have to be this, sort of white hood wearing bigot who has a racial preference. And in reality, it comes down to a racial preference is not to say that man is not my brother, that man is not my brother in Christ, that he does not have the same dignity and that he is made in the same equal image of God as I am. Is simply to say that as one would prefer their family or their kin, so too would one prefer their similar race. And that's perfectly fine. We see this throughout the, sort of the Bible, especially in the story of the Israelites and, really the people of Israel. Oftentimes they would treat very righteous people of other tribes and other nations with full respect and love. And in fact, were commanded to, yet it didn't undermine the fact that they still had a certain identity within that. And the two can be perfectly harmonious with each other. In fact, I would argue that if you were to say that if you were to condemn really sort of prejudice towards other races, that it would be more prejudice to say that by one saying that somehow by one saying, I would prefer to marry a white woman or I'd prefer to have white children, that it's this sort of targeting when someone is not wishing harm upon anyone else, or they're not wishing to harm anyone else, that you are deliberately attacking them for that preference when harm does not even enter the equation or any sort of animosity. So really, to boil it all down, this is a wholly modern phenomenon. And it is one that unfortunately, I think a lot of well-meaning people get intertwined with because they think racial preference means racial prejudice, and the two are completely separate from one another.
For the sake of playing devil's advocate, I think that there are people who would say you're being prejudiced then if you say that I want my kids to go to an all-white school or majority school, then by default you have to turn away non-whites. You have to deprive them the ability to go to that school, and so therefore you are somehow downstream causing harm to them, whether it's inferior education, inferior economic opportunities, professional opportunities, and so on. So It's like, at first we start with the conversation about, well, what do you mean by racism? And then if you try to simply say, well, it's maybe let's use some different language and say, well, it's racial prejudice. Well, then they'll say, well, what do you mean by prejudice? Is it stuff? Because if you want an all-white neighborhood, if you want an all-white school, then what we're saying is you actually have to legalize discrimination, is what you genuinely have to do. And that word has become so taboo. To say that anybody discriminates in their life, the only reason you would ever discriminate must be coming from a place of hatred or xenophobia or some other kind of negative emotion. Whereas discrimination, we all do this on a daily basis when it comes to our friend circles, when it comes to what romantic partner you choose, even the professional services you hire, you discriminate. You want to see credentials. You want to see a past pattern of behavior to know that these people are trustworthy, that they have the same values as you do. So it's not even that discrimination in itself is wrong either. So I try to really get down to figuring out how we can articulate such a nuanced subject in a way that helps non-whites, helps non-Christians understand that just because we're demanding a space for ourselves doesn't mean that we want harm to anybody else.